The corporate machinations of the late 90s video game industry have resulted in a rather aggressive climate at the top of the industry pile. Had dealings between North American, European, and Japanese companies gone another way, the breakout success of Rockstar games may have never been, and perhaps that climate wouldn't be so hostile. But it was in 1998 when Take-Two Interactive acquired the video game branch of German multimedia organization Bertelsmann Music Group, that a growing studio in Dundee was swept into the tempest of the highest tier of the video game industry. The BMG Interactive entity had held the publishing rights to DMA Design's controversial Grand Theft Auto, and now in Rockstar's hands, the series would be elevated to terrific success. But this was not the first game DMA had created that featured a range of vehicles to drive, a selection of different guns to use, and threatened the welfare of pedestrians. And the concept certainly had been building momentum throughout DMA's earlier projects. DMA Design initially rose to prominence with the popularity of their 1991 puzzle game, Lemmings. Players would guide a group of the titular lemmings through various obstacle courses by assigning relevant roles to the lemmings in order to create a path to the level's exit. The game was massively approachable, leading to various ports and an estimated sales figure of about 20 million copies. DMA were ready to capitalize, developing expansions and sequels within the Lemmings series for the next few years, while also using the capital to experiment with other genres. With the release of Lemmings 2 on the Super Nintendo in 1993, DMA finally had some experience developing for a home console and decided to invest further. They had intended to create a platformer for the system and place a new mascot into the fray. Their innovative unicycle platformer quickly morphed into a racing game, as the playtesters found zooming around to be the most enjoyable aspect. Nintendo also found the concept to be fascinating, and came aboard to publish Unirally in 1994. Unfortunately, Pixar claimed the unicycles were far too similar to the unicycle from their 1987 short, Red's Dream. DMA lost the legal battle, but Nintendo were willing to continue working with the Dundee team. The Nintendo 64 was concluding development, and was in need of some launch titles to drive sales. One of these contracts landed with DMA Design. Over the next 2 years, DMA created Body Harvest, a third-person action game that featured multiple drivable vehicles, 5 enormous levels concluding with 5 unique boss encounters, an absurd quantity of aliens to battle, weapons to collect and use, as well as a large number of secrets to find. And Nintendo hated it. The focus on destruction and the ability to kill civilians were too far outside of Nintendo's family-orientated publishing plan, and DMA would have to find another avenue to see Body Harvest published. In 1997, DMA's Grand Theft Auto would be published by BMG Interactive, and the ensuing controversy over the game's violence quickly made Grand Theft Auto a household name. By the end of 1998, 1 million units had been sold, and DMA were deep into development of a sequel. The success of Grand Theft Auto inspired a handful of publishers to compete for DMA's publishing rights, which saw the eventual publication of Body Harvest and Space Station Silicon Valley for the Nintendo 64 by Gremlin Interactive. 1998 also saw Take-Two's acquisition of BMG Interactive, ensuring that all future titles developed by DMA Design would be published by Rockstar Games. Had Grand Theft Auto not become subject to controversy, it is very likely that Body Harvest, Space Station Silicon Valley, and Wild Metal would never have seen publication. But with Gremlin Interactive's takeover in 1999, it is clear that the hype surrounding Grand Theft Auto was not marketable enough alone. Body Harvest sees the player take up the role of Adam Drake, a genetically enhanced super soldier who has been sent back in time to thwart the repeated invasions and subsequent harvests of humanity by an evil alien army. The repeated attacks between 1916 and 2016 had left humanity on the brink of extinction, meaning Drake is humankind's last hope. The player will travel to 4 major invasion points throughout the 20th century in order to remove the aliens' processor biomachines and defeat any form of alien presence within the vicinity. Drake has made this journey fairly unprepared, and is forced to scavenge weapons and transportation while on Earth. This leads into the exploration and vehicular gameplay loops, as the player will feel that lack of munitions when confronted by a harvesting swarm. Body Harvest features all forms of vehicles for the player to use, ranging from station wagons to V8s, planes and helicopters, airboats and warships. This variety is unprecedented on a Nintendo 64 cartridge, and is certainly one of the most impressive features Body Harvest contains. With all of these vehicles, the player would travel around the game's gigantic levels in pursuit of a handful of different goals. The steps to defeating an alien swarm within Body Harvest are initially very simple, but as the player's successes cause the aliens to become more desperate, the strategies for defeating their attacks become more convoluted. What was a string of battles ending with a confrontation with the processor becomes a multi-pronged scavenger hunt to open a door that eventually leads to a means to reach and combat the processor. This transition isn't well indicated, so unless the player is a clairvoyant, they will spend a significant portion of time searching for the means to proceed. Sometimes there are NPCs who offer a hint, but often they say very little that is directly helpful. For example, the player will need 3 pieces of a totem pole, which inspires a Native American elder to destroy a part of the mountainside and access a military base that contains some helicopters. The location of 2 of these pieces is obvious and relatively effortless to access. The third is easily missed, and right beside the most dangerous location within this portion of the level. The Elder claims these pieces have been absent from his possession for a long time, so he cannot offer much assistance in the search. The map additionally says nothing more than find a way to access the military base. The rest is up to the player to solve, and while this is a push toward the free-form objective completion that the Grand Theft Auto series would later embrace, the goal of traveling to a specific indoor location to retrieve a specific item is not something that benefits from a wide, open level and Drake's sluggish movements. Body Harvest is, of course, a game developed for the Nintendo 64, which means the controls have to be mapped to the system's abominable controller, and I'd say that the scheme is the best that it could be. What is subpar is the game's speed and lack of precision. Drake's run speed is hilariously slow and only worsens indoors. He has to spend a significant portion of time turning, and cannot aim his weapon while on the move. This gives the entire game a very cumbersome feel and makes all of the on-foot sections into an uncomfortable slog. Drake can free aim, which has a helpful amount of auto-aiming built in, but the selection cone is rather narrow, so the player is incentivized to use the reticle instead. The reticle is also very slow, and if fighting certain enemies without a vehicle to shield from damage, it is likely this slowness will cause the player to be killed, much like the movement can. Slopes are a peculiar problem for a game to have issues with, but Body Harvest's lack of attraction value means that standing on a slope will cause Drake to slowly slide down it, and reascending the hill is often impossible. Irrespective of whichever difficulty the player selects, these slippery slopes are ever present, and just as likely to cause the player's death on very easy as they are on very hard. There are a number of conditions that, when met, will cause the player to fail and be sent back to the last checkpoint. Naturally, death is one of these, but so is allowing too many humans to be harvested within a level. If a harvest swarm is allowed to wreak havoc without intervention for too long, they will begin harvesting humans and increasing the bar in the lower left. If that bar maxes out during a level, game over, the bugs have won. There is no way to reduce the fill amount, and the harvesters will increase it indefinitely even if there aren't any humans around to be harvested. Killing civilians also causes this failure bar to increase, although this can be used to minimize the quantity of potential harvests if the player is currently battling the swarm. There are some other fail states that aren't accompanied by a UI bar. Drake can swim tiny distances, but will begin drowning if he is within deep water for more than a few seconds. He is just an inexplicably weak swimmer, and failing to make it out of a body of water within 5 seconds, moving at the pace Drake does, is not a state that I would consider death. It does send the player back to the checkpoint though. Moreover, many of the high-sided pits that cannot be escaped from are not strictly a death sentence for Drake, as there may be enough land for him to comfortably waddle around on. Without an escape route, these are also checkpoint warps that can be frustratingly easy to fall into. The frustration wouldn't be so bad if the checkpoints were more liberally spread throughout a level, but they are only ever spawned when a processor is destroyed. The segments between processors can last upward of 40 minutes, but regularly sit around the 30-minute range. This means that a poorly timed vehicle destruction, a mishap on a precarious ledge, or something interesting across a pond can cost the player a lot of time. My save file time is actually only 20% of the real time I spent with Body Harvest. 80% of my playtime was lost progress. That kind of investment might clue you into how little this game is interested in the player enjoying the experience. The music is confirmation of this. Body Harvest contains no more than 7 tracks, all of which sound like MIDI demos for what would be the real music later on. The Nintendo 64 isn't the most sonically advanced video game console, but Rare's soundtrack could convince many listeners otherwise. Not only are there very few tracks, but what is here is awfully boring. There's very little style or charm within each song, but it is fortunate that the game's sound cues aren't ever important. The visuals have a native appeal that comes packaged with every Nintendo 64 cartridge. I admit I have a bit of a soft spot for low poly characters and environments, and Body Harvest certainly delivers in those categories. Drake is rather uninteresting, but the alien insects are tremendously diverse, and the game regularly adds new enemies to encounter. The various levels are all massive and filled with delightful little buildings. There are even buildings to go into and get a peek at the furniture someone had to model. Each of Body Harvest's levels are incredibly large, but they're divided by a series of alien shields that break the map down into smaller chunks. Each chunk will contain all of the components required to advance to the next, which is primarily a processor and a nearby portal. The first couple of levels, Greece and Java, are filled with lakes and rivers, so the time spent traversing across water is much higher than any other level. Flight begins to appear more frequently as the game goes on, reducing the overall travel time across levels once at that later stage. Before then, these giant distances will have to be crossed on the ground, hopefully in a car of some kind, but quite often on foot. If Rockstar North is a developer that you have a personal affinity for, or the Grand Theft Auto series is particularly important to you, then Body Harvest will probably appeal to you. Many of the mechanics within Body Harvest are paralleled within the Grand Theft Auto series, and that no time for formality writing style is even readable in the text. It lacks that fundamental freedom though. Body Harvest places the player in a gigantic world with a lot of different capabilities, but it very often forces the player down a narrow path where failure to comply means the fun is over. The game wants the player to engage with the least satisfying parts of the experience at all times, which means slowly running from place to place, constant rummaging through drawers and boxes, having a huge pile of enemies dumped onto the player the moment they walk out of a door, and a 30-minute run back to wherever they failed. This game is far less enthralling than Grand Theft Auto, and the parts Nintendo purportedly objected to are not nearly the biggest problems within Body Harvest. If blowing up buildings and running people over were truly the deal-breaking concerns, as Mike Daly claimed in an interview with NowGamer posted in 2010, then I can only assume that Super Mario 64 was an accident. And given Nintendo's track record with the Super Mario series at that point, I don't believe it was. After spending more than 20 hours with Body Harvest, I am certain the reason Nintendo dropped the launch title publication of DMA's first 3D video game was because Body Harvest is nothing short of a train wreck. Thanks for watching. Next week, I'll be playing something good. I promise.
From birth, the children of the North hear tales of the end of the world. Ragnarok.